So I'm Alan Tate. I chair the Student Liaison Committee for the MFSA, and I have the pleasure of introducing the youngest and the best-dressed panel of the day. So all of you know that this has been a very difficult year on the MIT campus and on campuses around the country with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the resultant student demonstrations. And our president, Sally Kornbluth, has gotten onto a national stage. She's been working to lead us through these times. But the question is, what do the students have to say about this conflict? And that's basically the title of this panel is Student Perspectives on a Fraught Year for Campus Expression. So I have the pleasure of, I'll introduce just the moderator, Spencer Sindhusen, and he's a sophomore at MIT, and he is also the president of the MIT Open Discourse Society, which is an official campus student organization, something that we're very proud of. We've tried to work with the students over the past couple of years to get this organization formed. They promote interactions with different viewpoints and host speakers and host debates. And so give me just a moment of a warm welcome for our student panelists.
Thank you. So I just want to say a quick thank you to Alan for the intro. Thank you to the MFSA for, there we go. All right, thank you to the MFSA for hosting this great panel. Thank you to our speakers for being here, and thank you all, the audience, for attending this important panel. And so let's get the show going. Before we begin, I would like to introduce our great guest speakers, and they're Isaac Locke and Will Sussman. So gentlemen, feel free to give your intros and get the show going.
Sure, so I can go ahead and start. So my name is Isaac Locke. I am currently a senior at MIT. I'm double majoring in biological engineering and philosophy. I'm involved in free speech and free expression on campus. I am a part of MIT's Civil Discourse Project, which is co-sponsored by MIT Philosophy, and Concourse, which is also a learning community which I'm part of. My role in that is I'm a debate fellow, which means that I help facilitate student debates within the Concourse community, as well as help host several speaker events that the Civil Discourse Project holds throughout the year. Just a couple weeks ago, we had one on is capitalism defensible, and we invited a couple speakers to come sort of debate those issues and see what we think about them, and then actually tomorrow we're going to have a student debate on a similar topic as well. So I'm very committed to the sort of ideals of free speech. I consider them very, very important to not just members of a society, but especially on a college campus, I think. I think especially on a college campus or any place of learning, it's very important to have this sort of ability to think and speak freely and to explore ideas and do so in a way that is respectful and open as much as can be possible. So that's me. No real formalities yet, but I'm sure we'll get into some of the meat of the conversation shortly.
I guess that means I'm up. Hi, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Will. I'm a fourth-year PhD student in computer science here at MIT, and I'm just Jewish. So the turmoil on campus has affected me also in my capacity as now immediate past president of MIT Graduate Hillel. So I have some thoughts about free speech. I think it's a little bit of a red herring. I think the real issue that we've had on campus is about the rules not being followed, and that has sort of ripple effects that we'll get into. But if there's one thing that I want you all to take away from what I say today, it's that I think one's rights end where others' rights begin, and Jewish students have the same rights that any other students have on campus.
All right, well, thank you, Isaac and Will, and that's actually a great segue into our conversation. So first of all, as we know, last year we had a lot of things that happened on MIT campus that made it onto the national stage, and so I just want to know, like personally, we can read all the news articles, we can look at all the videos on news networks, on YouTube, on social media, but I want to know your perspectives, your experiences, and your observations, and like that's what we can't get anywhere else. So, would you mind sharing some things about that?
Sure, yeah. So for me, it definitely, the period that we had last year, and I mean, even continuing now, of, this sort of very intense turmoil over Israel and Palestine, it was really, really a time of heightened anxieties and heightened emotions for everybody. I think people on both sides had, very, very strong opinions that they felt that they should express, and that very often led to conflicts on campus between people, with opposing viewpoints. And I think I was not particularly involved with going to any sort of student protests or organizations or anything like that on this. The MIT Civil Discourse Project, we did host an event on Israel and Palestine, but that's about the extent of my involvement with any, formal engagement with the topic. But simply just being on campus, it was sort of impossible to ignore the signs and the chants and the tents and the everything that was happening all over campus. It was just sort of something that, whether or not you wanted to hear about it, it was always there. And, I think we can get into later my personal views on the issue, but I think that regardless of what your views on it were, it was a really, really difficult time for all students on campus, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, regardless of where you fall on the issue itself. And it was a very difficult time, and it's something that I think we're still reeling from, and that we still have to figure out a way to deal with as a community, as an institute who imposes rules upon us, and as people who have to coexist alongside each other and go to classes at some point.
So I agree with virtually everything he said. The one thing I might quibble about is I think that there are communities on campus that are more affected than others. I can only speak for my own experience in the Jewish community, but it's hard to focus on getting your work done when there are people chanting for the death of your family. Like From the River to the Sea is well understood to be a call for the genocide of Jews between the river and the sea. That said, people have free speech rights. They can say what they like. The problem is, in order for the university to function, there are well-established time, place, and manner restrictions. That's the sort of the term of art. And these restrictions are routinely broken. I'll give you two examples. The first example was back in November, so 1 month after October 7th. The protesters occupied a building which is never supposed to be occupied for purposes of protesting. It's the main entrance of the university. It's a thoroughfare for all students. And so commandeering that space is not allowed. MIT set a horrible precedent at the end of that day by telling the students, if you don't leave, you will be suspended, and then backed off of that threat. They said, actually, if you get suspended, and you're on a visa, then you might end up getting deported. And so therefore, we're not going to issue suspensions. Instead, we're going to suspend the student organization, whatever that means. And so the result has been that the same students that have been causing all this chaos create a bunch of shell organizations because MIT is unwilling, or at least it set this precedent, that it is unwilling to punish the individuals, not for their speech, but for their conduct. And so this grew and grew until, I think it was April of this year, when students commandeered another space on campus, the Kresge Oval, which is an open area that you're able to reserve properly. And in fact, Hillel, which is the organization that I represented, had reserved that space properly months in advance for the annual celebration of Israel's Independence Day, Yom Ha'atzmaut. And MIT knew that this was coming when the encampment was set up. And MIT did not take it down in time for the event that we had properly planned. So what ended up happening is we had to postpone our event. And again, your rights end where mine begin. They prevented Jewish students, Hillel, from using the space that we had properly reserved because they wanted to say their part. If they want to say their part, they can also make a reservation and follow the rules. But they're not following the rules, and it's particularly felt within some communities on campus.
Yeah, well, those are really tough times for being a student on campus, definitely, and those are chaotic times, and I actually experienced not persecution or anything like in person, but anger responses. So I can see a lot of like anger and temperature that was raised significantly during that year, and I think it was really unfortunate what happened to Hillel and the rules not being enforced properly. And in my case, I sent out an email. There's actually a resolution that the undergraduate association was voting on, and it relates a little bit to the Israel and Palestine war. It's more of a proclamation. And I sent my piece. I sent an email, which through a system called dorm spam, which we're going to go into a little later. And I go, it goes out to the entire campus, and it got a lot of angry responses. And I think that's my share of experience. But yeah, I observed a lot of what you guys talked about, a lot of demonstrations, a lot of student activity, and a lot of unfortunate circumstances. But let's move on to the next topic, which relates to this topic. So as I alluded to earlier, we got a lot of media coverage. The MIT president, Sally Kornbluth, went in front of Congress. We got a lot of attention from politicians, from CNN, from Fox, from all the media outlets. And so I just want to know, like, do you see any kind of, is there any missing pieces from media portrayals of what happened on MIT campus, or any discrepancies, or anything they sort of reported but maybe require context? I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. So to me, I think, in terms of whether the news was being reported factually, I mean, I think like all news, if you read Fox News, you're going to get a very different narrative than if you read CNN. Obviously just two sort of different narratives being painted here. And I think what was left out was different based on where you're getting your news from. I think different news sources are going to leave out different little key components that might matter. To me, I think one of the biggest pieces that was left out, at least on the side of the sort of the pro-Palestine protesters, was the fact that thankfully, I think MIT was sort of put up there on the pedestal with a lot of other universities. I do not think that the extent of the protests that we experienced, we did not have any violence on our campus. There were some small isolated incidents, but there was not any like mass, destruction of property or, mass assaults on people. And that's something that I think if you just sort of read the news and you see, reports from Columbia and MIT and, a bunch of other universities compiled all together, it makes it seem like it was sort of the same on MIT's campus. Whereas I think MIT was actually much more even-keeled than a lot of these other universities were.
Yeah, it's funny. There are some people in Israel who think that we have it worse on college campuses in America than they do in Israel right now during this war. So I agree. The media, I think, my critique is really that they focus on the wrong things. Like they like to talk about like, oh, they set up tents. Great, they set up tents. Like, but they don't get into like why that's actually wrong. Like I said, like the statements are offensive, but like they're allowed to make their statements. The problem is when it's discriminatory, when they're preventing other people from being able to speak. And the other thing that I think that the media could do better is they're supposed to be journalists. They're supposed to fact check a lot of the claims that are being made, even specifically at MIT. One example is the protesters keep claiming this $4 million figure, that MIT is allegedly taking $4 million from Israel to build killer drones and other things. None of that is true. The actual number is something like 2 million, and that comes from the Department of Defense, which subcontracts with the Israeli military. MIT has put out statements explaining some of the details of this, but people don't care about facts. And I think it's the role of the media to sort of point out, like, hey, like this protest, aside from the flashy parts, it's also just factually wrong, and also morally wrong, in my opinion.
Thank you for your perspective on this, and I actually think that it's really important to highlight the differential enforcement rules that was imposed on different organizations at MIT, like with the Kresge incident, the demonstration that happened. There are some issues with registration and how space reservation worked, but I think you described it perfectly. So I think let's switch gears to the current state of being. And I just want to know what campus conversations or campus expressions, demonstrations look like? Like from my perspective, from what I've seen, I think things have calmed down a little bit. Not a lot of demonstrations going on right now, and just want to know, especially with the presidential election coming up in I think 6 weeks or like 30, a little bit. So how do you see campus conversations right now? Do you think, what do you think would be the trajectory of student expression going forward?
You want to go first?
Sure. So the most recent example that I can think of, MIT had its famed fall career fair. Many of you probably know about this. Some of you probably got your jobs from that. The protesters are intent on making sure that the rest of us also remain unemployed because they put up signs saying some libelous things like this company or that company is complicit in genocide, when MIT very clearly, again, months in advance, put up clear rules saying that the career fair is not an appropriate place for a protest. If you want to stand outside and give out flyers, fine, you can do that. But commandeering a space to put up your message is not appropriate when people are just trying to get jobs. The other recent development is the protesters set up a recurring protest that every Monday, not on the steps of MIT because MIT is private property, so MIT has control over that, but just outside of the steps of Lobby 7, that's City of Cambridge, and I don't know if they have a permit for it, but they have said that every Monday at 4:30 they are going to be outside of Lobby 7, and I don't think it's a coincidence that this year, October 7th, falls on a Monday, and we are having our vigil also at 4:30. So read from that what you like.
Sure. So, I mean, I think in terms of the things that are being talked about on campus, I think the Israel-Palestine issue, as you sort of pointed out, is still a huge topic that people are discussing, and we're still having rallies and stuff that we're seeing, including right in front of Lobby 7, the main entrance to MIT. I mean, there's also several other issues that are taking place. I mean, with the election coming up, I think there's sort of heightened emotions and stuff around that in general across campus. You know, there are huge efforts to get people out to vote, get people registered, all that kind of stuff. But I do just want to briefly touch on some of the stuff that Will has brought up, and that's that MIT is somehow like not enforcing its rules and allowing these protests to continue. I as someone who considers myself vaguely left of center, maybe not super far left or anything, but certainly left of center, I am somewhat sympathetic to the views of these protesters who have very strong emotions and I think should have a right to express themselves. And on the issue of whether or not the rules are being enforced, I think that it's important to consider the fact that if we look back in history to the civil rights movement, sometimes you have to break rules to make a point. And I wouldn't necessarily urge protesters to do violence or harm anybody, but protesting in a very visible place I think makes sense. And I may not support everything that they say and everything that they do, but I think on the very basis of breaking rules, at some point rules have to be broken when you're facing something which is such a challenging issue for so many people, and especially when the sort of status quo is not on your side.
So I understand this point. The one thing that I would add is that even during the civil rights movement, when people were breaking rules, the point was there were discriminatory laws, and they would sit in the street and block cars. So blocking cars is not directly addressing the discrimination. I understand this whole argument that it's making a sort of a public show that there's a problem here. And then when the people are mistreated or arrested or what have you, then the public will say oh, there's a real problem here, we need to deal with this. So if people truly believe that this is the cause that they want to fight for, and they're willing to even break the rules for that, they also have to be willing to accept the consequences. And so far what we've seen on campus is that there have not been consequences for the people who are repeatedly breaking the rules. They're allowed, if they want to break the rules, they just have to be willing to accept those consequences.
I mean, that's interesting. I mean, I would just pose a question. I mean, if that is the case, I think just on the part of MIT when they enforce those rules, if that involves, potentially sending in police to brutalize protesters, is that something that you think is okay on the part of MIT to do?
I mean, it's a fair question of exactly what is the appropriate response. But really the punishments that I'm talking about are suspending students. MIT finally did this after the encampment. It reached a breaking point where it seemed like there was imminent violence going to happen. So MIT decided finally it needed to step in, take some action, and it suspended students. But because the disciplinary process is controlled by a faculty committee, which is very sympathetic to these protesters, they decided to let them off scot-free, as opposed to being like a jury where the jury is required not to consider the impact on the students, but decide whether the rules were broken, and then there's a separate sentencing process to determine how you address that. So there's some disciplinary issues in how MIT responds to these students. I'm less familiar with like the police angle of it, but I think even if you don't involve police at all, there's still punishments that can be done after the fact that would set a better precedent.
Well, that's a very good exchange, and I'd just like to point out a little bit that there are like a lot of parallels between what happened, what you guys mentioned, and I'm not going to offer my opinion on this, but just going to draw a parallel a little bit between what you guys said and what happened at Berkeley in the 60s, and that actually was the birth of the free speech movement with student expressions. Actually, the Open Discourse Society is actually hosting an event in a few weeks that's going to be focused on this particular topic. So I think that's a very interesting and very complicated issue, like this tension between enforcing rules and sort of like advancing the cause of free speech or allowing things to be said. And I think I can relate to how people feel on both sides of the issue. I got people who I know are directly affected. So I just want to say I think this is a very complicated topic. But let's move on to the topic a little bit of I think you guys talk a little bit about the presidential election, and do you guys see any demonstration? I think from my perspective, there has not been a lot of political activism going on with regards to the election, and I wasn't here in 2020, so Isaac and Will, you're probably here 4 years ago.
We were not.
Oh my God, I'm an embarrassment to the MIT. I can't do math, but so just let's go back to 2022. Do you guys see any? Do you guys see any? I know those sort of the aftermath of COVID, and people might not have been back to state of normalcy. But do you guys observe anything back in 2022? And are there any things that are happening now with regard to the election?
I think whoever wins in November is going to cause lots of protests. My impression from our friends on the other side of this issue, at least on the other side of my position, is that both parties, both candidates are responsible for genocide, in their words. And so I'm not optimistic about whomever wins. So that's probably all I got.
I mean, yeah, similarly, I think regardless of what your standpoint is, I think it's hard to disagree that the temperature on American politics has been cranked up to 11 for sure. And I think no matter what happens for this election, there's going to be a lot of heartache. I think on MIT's campus specifically, I think MIT as a student body is decidedly left of center. So, I mean, I think if Kamala Harris wins, there's going to be probably not a lot that happens. I think that if Donald Trump wins, we will see a lot of potential, maybe not demonstrations, but a lot of heartache that we'll see on campus, and a lot of people that are going to be very, very upset.
I will add one little thing, which is that my undergrad was Yale, which is also decidedly left of center. And when I came to MIT, at least I had this impression that MIT was a little bit more apolitical, not left or right, but just sort of more interested in STEM than in politics. And clearly something has changed, if that was ever true. I thought I had escaped the sort of left-wing environment coming here, and that was not the case. So culturally, I think something is different. Maybe it's that MIT is seen as like a ninth Ivy, and so students come to MIT, and we select for those kind of students. But I think there's some cultural issues that are behind the scenes of all this.
I mean, I'll just add that certainly I think MIT as an institution is far less politically involved than some place like Yale probably is. I've never been to Yale, but I imagine it must be like that there, that there are a lot of students who are very interested in political science and philosophy and these sorts of things, whereas I think on the whole, MIT students, the majority of them are probably more concerned about doing their physics PSATs than they are about who wins the election, in all honesty. I think that though, even then on the sort of big issues like who wins an election, that's where people get upset. I think if you were to stop a random MIT student in the Infinite Corridor and ask them some political question related to policy, half of them would probably not have a very strong opinion about it. And that's something that I think is, maybe not good, but also maybe not bad about MIT, but it's just sort of a difference of culture that we are certainly a STEM school.
Yeah, those are actually great observations, and I can actually relate to it. It's one of the reasons why I picked MIT, actually, when I chose my undergrad institution. I saw him as somebody who's a little right of center. I thought, I'd be a lot less involved in controversy and all that if I go to MIT as opposed to the Ivies and some of the other institutions. But I think there's definitely more involvement than I thought. But I probably agree. I got folks at Harvard and some other Ivy institutions who were talking to me and what happened in terms of politics. I think MIT is a lot less chaotic and a lot less. I think MIT. I can actually relate to this. A lot of people are concerned about their physics PSATs and all their stuff. So I think that's actually the appeal of MIT. When I thought about it, I thought STEM people would be more concerned with STEM and less concerned with political science or what goes on and current events and all that. But I think, well, you pointed out something interesting that there might have been a trend that changed. So I'm just wondering, from you guys' perspective, do you think that's because of social media, or what kind of social trend on campus, or what kind of human factor contributed to people being more politically involved? Which I actually think it's a good thing. Democracies can be driven forward with more political involvement, and so I just want to know your perspective on this, and we can tie this to how we can go forward from today.
Sure. So, from my perspective, it's sort of a collision of multiple factors, I think. I think one is that, like I said before, in general, the sort of heat in American politics has been cranked way up over the last, 10 years or so, I would say. And in general, there's just more people that are really caring about elections and caring about political issues, and there's sort of this sense on, I think on both sides of the aisle that, this election especially is going to matter a lot for the future of America, or for, what America is going to look like. I also think that, as Spencer mentioned, it's also probably having to do with things like social media and this sort of greater interconnectedness we have. It's, maybe this is just me. Social media is known to be self-selective, but at least on TikTok, it's hard to miss something that's a political content. And, once again, maybe this is self-selective and it's just me because I'm me and care about those issues. But it certainly seems as a generation, as people, especially recently, Gen Z has sort of decided that now it's time for us to make our stand. And I think that campuses, including MIT, which has, I think, previously been, as you mentioned, sort of an apolitical body, have decided to sort of come out of the woodwork and say, no, you know what, this is what we're going to make a stand on. These are the issues that matter the most to us, and we're gonna speak out about it.
I think the thing that I'm most sad about this cultural shift is that it's a shift away from critical thinking. I think a lot of people, as recently as I think yesterday, there was a talk. Someone from Harvard came down and was saying that clearly there's war crimes happening on Israel's part. Unquestionably was the word she used. And I went up to her and I said, I have some questions. Which war crimes are you accusing Israel of doing? And she said, well, isn't it obvious? All of the human rights organizations are saying that there are war crimes. And so her argument was not that anything was fundamentally against international law. It was, look at all these figures of authority that are saying that it's war crimes, and because they say it, and I agree with the values that these organizations put forward, that therefore they must be correct, and I'm going to agree with them. And there's this gap between what's actually happened and people's opinion of what's happening. It's on the basis of, I think for many students, it's if someone you admire, if there's a politician that you like, or if there's a celebrity that you follow, and they're saying that they're for something, rather than look into the details of the issue, it's well, this person agrees with it, so I have to agree with it as well. And this happens on both sides. I think I'm disappointed that there's not more students at places like MIT who would sort of dig into it and actually figure out what is their position independent of what other people think about the issues.
I mean, I think I'll sort of refute that to some extent. I think that saying that MIT has just sort of lost the ability for critical thought is a gross overstatement. That I think MIT students are still some of the best critical thinkers in the world. I think that MIT students, many of them, think through these issues very seriously, take them very seriously, do their own research. I mean, there are lots of students that I see, you know, maybe posting in dorm spam or talking about it in dining halls or what have you, that like genuinely do know a lot about these topics and genuinely really do care. I think that there is a small minority of students who, you know, sort of don't care. There is the sort of like archetypal MIT student that is only concerned about their math classes and, you know, doesn't really care and just sort of believes whatever the sort of mainstream view of their friends and the people they admire. But I think that on the whole, for MIT students, I think to say that we're not critical thinkers is pretty crazy.
No, I agree. That wasn't my intention.
Okay.
I think there's maybe two parts to this. The first part is I think we have some great critical thinkers in their chosen domain. We might have like the best roboticist or the best computer scientist, the best mathematician. And there's this assumption that because you're good at your chosen discipline, that means you must be brilliant in every other discipline. Like there's I think, a lack of humility that maybe you don't actually know everything. And I think it's also really important, this is another theme that I hope you take away from today. Free speech is not just about speaking, it's also about listening. Like the idea put forward, I think it was the Red Lion case, was about the uninhibited marketplace of ideas where the truth will prevail. And so if you're only ever talking and finding sources that you agree with and being in your own echo chamber, which we came to this because we were talking about social media, I think there's a huge contributing factor here, then you'll never actually arrive, you'll never make progress if you're not listening to some things that challenge what you believe. And I think lately, people are hearing things that might challenge their worldview, and rather than adjust the model of the world that they hold in their heads, they assert that the model is correct, and actually that's fake news. Or actually the thing I've heard recently is that the ADL is not credible. So it's the selectivity. I'm sure the students are all very smart and great critical thinkers in some respects, but I think we all need a little more humility and need to listen some more.
I mean, I think that that's true. I think that we are much more critical thinkers when it comes to, you know, science and technology and engineering domains, for sure. But I would greatly refute the point that MIT students sort of can't think in terms of political issues or, you know, sort of big societal problems. I think that MIT students are very in tune with those sorts of issues, and it may not be all of them. I think that a greater percentage of MIT students are sort of out of touch with those things than they are at, you know, Yale or Harvard. Certainly, but I do also want to point out maybe one small minutia that might be contradictory in your point, which is that, you know, we do have to listen. We do have to say that, you know, I am a biological engineer at some point, and, you know, maybe I don't know everything about political science or politics or, you know, anthropology or history or what have you. But also, there is this sense that we have to think on our own. And to me, it seems like, you know, in the case that you offered, if an expert is saying something like war crimes are being committed, you know, at what point are we to believe those experts? And I think that in many cases, if somebody who is an expert on an issue, you know, just taking their word, you know, maybe doing our own investigating, corroborating those sources with other experts as well, I think that's, you know, what we should expect of people in a society. You know, we can't expect everybody to go be their own investigative journalist and do all of their own research. But at some point, we do have to sort of trust these experts.
Right. I agree with that as well. It's more that when there are other experts out there, like I would question some of the experts that people are citing in the first place, but when other experts offer an alternative view, and again, like, right, the free speech is about the marketplace of ideas. If there are other ideas out there that contradict some of these experts, and people are just unwilling to hear those ideas, that's a problem. So maybe we'll move on to the next question. I don't know how much time we got.
You guys raised like really good points. I think there's definitely a good share of MIT students who are great critical thinkers. I actually know some of my peers who had extended conversations. They differ from me, like politically, but yeah, we were able to have like reasonable conversation with them, and we actually dove into the topic of, for example, economic policy and whether tariffs would be, you know, economically useful, or whether, you know, maybe this type of foreign policy might be, you know, would contribute to world peace or that type of thing. So there are definitely people who are reasonable, but I also agree that there's a small but probably vocal minority of people who might not, who may be impeded by hubris or who may be following, like you said, experts without too much critical. But I also relate to the concern that we can't all be investigative journalists. We have, especially at MIT, we're all have time constraints. We have P-sets to turn in. We got group student clubs to run. We got jobs to go after, grad school applications, or all that stuff. So I think it's really important to keep all these in mind. And so I want to move on to the future. And so with these issues in mind, and how do you see us as students? How do you see students sort of doing better, or what kind of things are there that we can do to advance the civil discourse and free speech on campus, make people better listeners, but also qualified critical thinkers in all spheres?
Sure. I mean, I think for me, one of the biggest things is that, MIT is this place where a lot of people, don't care about things like the humanities. They don't care about, political issues that much, or, they only care about selective ones, or, these people don't really care about history or philosophy or anthropology or, all these sort of humanistic fields that I think are very, very important. As I mentioned, I'm a second major in philosophy as well, so I find these things incredibly important. So I think moving forward, it's very important for MIT students to sort of recognize the importance of this cross-disciplinary talk, of, thinking about how their actions are involved with the world, especially as who will eventually become some of the world's top scientists and engineers. I think it's very important for these people to understand how the actions that they're taking, the things that they're designing, the research that they're doing, how that is going to interface with the world and how it's going to affect other people. I think that MIT students have some of the brightest minds in the world. I think that it's a travesty if they don't apply that to a plethora of fields. If they sort of just sit down and they say, well, I'm going to be a physicist, I'm only ever going to read about physics, I'm only ever going to think about physics. I think that to not put that mind to great use is, an abandonment of themselves and of the world in some way. And I think that there is, I think, a very strong moral burden on these MIT students to become better at all of these sorts of things and become better with knowing their place in the world and where they fit into things and how they can actually make the world a better place. And also, I think, in terms of on campus itself, one of the biggest things that especially we've been working towards with the Civil Discourse Project is getting people to listen. And that's something that I'm sure everyone in this room, by virtue of us being here, probably thinks is an important thing. I think that a lot of MIT students, do care about political issues, maybe a select number of them, but they just want to talk. I think that not a lot of people actually want to listen. And this is something that Will sort of alluded to previously, and that's something that I think is a major problem on MIT's campus as well as campuses across the world and probably in society in general, is that people don't really want to listen to opposing viewpoints. And I think that that's actually where the sort of real meat is that, I have my views and, I can justify them to myself, but when somebody starts questioning me and starts saying, well, no, I disagree, I think that actually things are this way, I think that actually, no, I think that's not quite right, that's when we actually become better thinkers, and that's when we become better people and better members of society. And I think that's what we are missing out the most on, at least right now.
After October 7th, there were two sort of parallel lunches that were set up. One for the Jewish Israeli community, generally speaking. The other for the Arab Muslim MENA community. That's Middle Eastern, North African community. And somewhere along the way, someone realized, well, if we're only ever having our two lunches simultaneously on separate parts of campus, then we're never actually going to be talking to each other. And so they created this third space, which is creatively named Third Space, for students on a different day, so you don't have to choose between going to your own community's lunch and going to this third space, for people from both communities to come together and dialogue. This was the goal. And so I've been going ever since that started, and I think it's a great idea in principle. The problem is, at least from my point of view, there is one side that promotes what's called anti-normalization with Zionists. That we won't even talk to the Zionists because they represent all the evils in the world. They're the Nazis. They're the fascists. And so what ended up happening with this lunch largely speaking, is it ended up being a space for left-wing Jews to argue with right-wing Jews. Right. And so it's a fundamental problem. I don't know how, like, you can make every effort to bring the horse to water, but you can't force it to drink. And so if my friends on the other side are ever interested in having a conversation, I'm happy to buy the coffee. But I think this policy of anti-normalization is really the problem. And I don't think, to your point earlier, I don't think the vast majority of students subscribe to that ideology. I think a lot of people would be interested in having a conversation. It's just the most vocal, the most extreme people who are saying the most offensive things, which they're allowed to say, that's free speech, but they're also doing the most extreme things like setting up the encampment and taking over the buildings. As long as they are allowed to get away with breaking the rules with impunity, they're going to make it very difficult for people who are sympathetic to their cause to actually engage with the other side and move forward. So I think in order for campus to heal, I really think that the most extreme people who have broken rules need to face consequences, and then the rest of us can work on solutions.
I mean, I'll just say on the sort of, at least on the topic of this sort of like anti-normalization thing, this is something that I've heard about and that I think, at least for me, is categorically wrong. I think that this, like, not even being willing to engage in a conversation with someone is, I think, exactly the point at which our civil discourse, the point in which our society begins to break down. Once we reach a point where we are not even willing to listen to the other side, that's when I think things become very, very difficult. And I am sympathetic to students who, want to avoid that sort of space and want to avoid the sort of heartache that comes with those sorts of things and discussing those issues. I'm sympathetic to that, but I think that ultimately, if we're going to be good contributing members of society, at some point we have to sit down and talk with people we disagree with. At least for me, I've said in the past, like, I don't care who it is, I don't care how much I disagree with them, I will sit down and have a conversation. If, like, Adolf Hitler was here today, I would sit down and I would have a conversation with him. I do not care. I think that that's actually exactly what the problem with our society is that we don't listen to people, we're not willing to converse, and actually, maybe in hearing those arguments we disagree with, maybe we'll come away being more sympathetic to them, or maybe we'll actually just become better thinkers in ourselves and know why we believe what we believe.
Those are really great points, and I admire that philosophy. Like, it's actually, noble that we sit down and talk to people, and instead, like, now we sort of our society sort of fragments and gets compartmentalized into different camps of people who are right wing on a certain topic, who are left wing, who are have different opinions, and what's not happening is people having conversations, and actually I think that's what the Civil Discourse Project is doing really well, and with hosting events and getting people to talk across their political or philosophical or social issue stance, like, differences. And Isaac, you were talking a little bit about, like, contributing to society. So I want to move on to the next topic, which is us as MIT students. Like, how do we, well, not to sound self-aggrandizing, but we're beacons of sort of scholars and engineers and scientists in the world. Like, how do we, like, use this sort of honor or privilege or this type of position to help contribute to civil discourse or the movement of free speech in our communities, local, state, regional, national, however you define it?
I think we should lean into our strengths. There's clearly a lot of destruction going on in the Middle East, and I think if people are interested in making a difference, rather than calling for the elimination of a state, they should be offering to build solutions. Let's figure out how we can more efficiently deliver humanitarian aid, things like that. I think that's MIT's sweet spot, and I think more of that would be a good thing. But it seems that the politics of calling for the destruction of an entire state it takes precedence in this current moment, and I can't understand that.
I mean, yeah, I think that obviously MIT has a lot of strengths. We are top scientists and engineers. I think that is ultimately some of the greatest things that we can contribute to society. I think that, maybe something like that, designing how to deliver humanitarian aid better is a fantastic goal for MIT students to do, or, designing technologies to alleviate some of the, hardships that people face. I think that certainly is a huge part of what we have to do, but I also think MIT students have to think, sort of across these boundaries, have to think beyond just the engineering of what they're doing. They also have to think how is this actually going to be applied? Where is this going to be used? How are the people there going to be affected? How are the sort of further knock-on effects going to take place? And they have to sort of be very mindful of those sorts of things. And I think that MIT students, in considering not just in their little box of being an engineer, but also across, sort of the societal realms of how what they're making is going to affect people, I think that's how we're going to make our biggest impact.
Yeah, that's why we still have hope in society, with people like you, and I think there are many others who are invested in this mission, and so let's hope for the best. And so one other question I have is sort of like, I've heard that there's been a recent development with the dorm spam. So for those who don't know, this is like a pretty unique thing at MIT. Like dorm spam's an email system where you send an email and it goes to pretty much the entire campus. And sort of like the town square of MIT students, people can sell stuff on there. People can talk about different things, advertise events, or share their perspectives and viewpoints. And I heard there's some recent changes with the system, so would you guys be able to offer some perspectives on it? And I think like dorm spam is good, free speech place, but also it has been it's entailed a lot of fiery conversations. I was involved in one with actually multiple, but just want to know your perspectives on how the MIT community is affected on this, and how it can go forward, how campus conversations can be carried forth.
Sure. So to give you just a little bit more background on what dorm spam actually is. So how MIT works is, whenever you're assigned to a dorm building, as all freshmen are, at least their freshman year, you must live in a dorm. You're assigned also to a mailing list. So there's, I live in Next House. Our mailing list is next-forum@mit.edu. And if you email something to that email address, it forwards it to everybody who lives in that dorm. So there was, a compiled list of all of the dorms and their mailing lists. And then you could just send an email to effectively every single person at MIT all at once, or all of the undergraduates at least. The recent change was this year is now the first year in which students are not automatically added when they first get here. You're assigned to a dorm freshman year, but it's up to you whether or not to opt in and add yourself to that mailing list, which, on the part of MIT is, I guess, maybe allowing people to choose whether or not to get a bunch of, it's called dorm spam for a reason. You get a lot of emails in your inbox. I have heard some grumblings in the background. I'm not going to say this as a fact, but I will say that this is many people's suspicion anyway, that MIT's decision to do this was at least partially in response to the several demonstrations and protests and stuff that were organized last year on dorm spam. So, obviously if you're organizing a protest and you want to publicize it, here's a great way to send it to every single MIT undergraduate all at once. I think, at least to me, dorm spam was a great cultural thing for MIT, a great way to publicize things, a great way for MIT students to stay connected. And, even getting people to be politically active and engaged in the community, even if that is at demonstrations and protests, I think is a good thing, actually. And, I think that MIT taking that away is actually a step, if it is true on MIT's part, to sort of stop these protests and demonstrations from happening. It, could be a step in the wrong direction when it comes to free speech.
So I'm a grad student, so I don't have much experience with dorm spam, but every time I hear about it, it's always in a negative light. It's always like some student is targeting another student by name for having been an IDF veteran. And so then this person needs to write up like an essay-length response, to which the first person then writes an essay-length response back, and I can't imagine that this is a pleasant experience. So while I don't know all the background or the cultural aspects of dorm spam, I understand why they're looking to make some changes, because I can totally see this derailing students who are here to learn. Like at the end of the day, we are students. We're coming here for an education, for the most part in the sciences and engineering, and we're not supposed to be spending all day answering emails calling us genocidal terrorists.
I mean, yeah, I'll just say on that point, I think that absolutely the people that are using dorm spam as a means to dox people or something, absolutely I would disavow that use of dorm spam. I think that it is a very useful for, several things. A, for just like a cultural thing, for having the sort of interconnectedness of the MIT community. I think dorm spam or something like it is, at least from my understanding, pretty unique to MIT. Most other large universities don't have a way to email everybody all at once. And I think that's something very unique and good at MIT to publicize events. This is how at the Civil Discourse Project we send out our events and how we say, hey, here's this great opportunity to come hear from 2 leading experts in this field. Please come. And that often gets people to actually show up to our events. And I think it's a good thing. But I think that having political speech on there is not inherently bad. But when it sort of crosses this line into just like hurling insults, that's when I think on a free speech grounds people have the right to say that, but I think that they should not say those things.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for these perspectives, and I completely agree that there are things that are egregious that should not be said, but they might be not technically illegal or technically like violated the rules, but they're egregious and they shouldn't be said. But I think the sort of change with dorms ban, that's definitely going to affect MIT culture, and I guess we're going to have to wait and see. But I think we're hitting the time limit a little bit. So before we open up to audience questions, I want to ask you all if you have any final words before we turn over to Q&A.
I'll let you go first.
I think I'll just repeat some of the themes I said already, which is one's rights end where others' rights begin. Jewish students have free speech rights in the same way that some of the protesters have free speech rights, and if one comes at the expense of the other, that is no longer free speech. And the other thing I'll highlight is just this point about listening. I think you pointed out earlier, like thank you all for coming and listening to our perspectives. I think listening is sort of the only way forward. So thank you.
I mean, I'll also echo this thank you. Thank you all for being here. I think this is a tremendously important topic, for college campuses, but also for society at large to think about free speech, to think about what our roles are and what our duties to others are. I think, we've had a lot of discourse on campus that I think is very problematic and that I think, needs to be sought out more. And I think listening is ultimately the solution to all of these sorts of things. And free speech is how we do those things. I think I will sort of add on to the point of, one's rights end where another's rights begin. I definitely agree with that point. I think, however, the sort of difficult question is where one's rights begin. I think that, obviously I would agree we have a right not to, be assaulted or be, harassed in some way. But, do I have a right to not be not be offended or something in some way? I think there are open questions in many of these things that we have to answer, and I think that actually is a far more difficult question than many people think that it is.
All right, well, that's perfect. Thank you, Chairman, for all these insights. So now let's, you all have any questions? Awesome.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to the panel for an excellent discussion. Bill Ohm, class of '68. I heard 2 threads that I thought were in conflict, that would conflict with each other. The main thread was the importance of discourse and the importance of listening to both sides and having a respectful conversation. And then I picked up another thread at the beginning of the conversations, which was, well, these time, place, and manner restrictions that we have may need to be violated because something is so important to me that I'm going to take personal risk and violate time, space, and manner. And then there was a comment about police brutality, which I'd like to get some comments on if you've seen any. But do you believe that the time, place, and manner restrictions currently in place are appropriate or not appropriate?
Sure. So to me, I think that the time, place, and manner constraints that are currently in place are, at least for the most part, fairly reasonable, in my opinion. I think that they are. I think that there is a reason to sometimes violate them, though, and I think that comes on the part of many students who feel as though what they're saying is not being heard, right? They think that, if you have to apply to MIT and say, hey, we'd like to reserve this space to hold a demonstration, MIT has every right to say, well, no, we just don't think you should be able to do that. And at that point, if you do go to a place that is otherwise public, but that can be reserved, but that MIT has rejected your request for a reservation, at that point, what else are students to do if they feel like they're not being heard?
Follow the rules.
I mean, I agree that I agree that students should, at least in general, follow the rules. But I think that ultimately, if MIT is not allowing students to express themselves to the extent that they feel that they're being listened to, I think that becomes slightly problematic at some point.
Everybody follows the rules. If Am I on? Thank you. Steve Carhart, class of 70. Thanks a lot, guys, for coming and for the thought and modeling civil discourse. One thread which comes from my experience in the 60s regarding civil disobedience was that if you engaged in civil disobedience, and this goes to the anti-war movement, it goes to the environmental movement, it goes to the civil rights movement, if you engaged in civil disobedience, you were committing yourself to accepting the civil consequences of that, okay? So that was given. So just kind of run up the flagpole for a set of stances, which I think was actually followed pretty well, but for sharpening things up for dealing with this situation. Number one, consistent, content-neutral, firm employment of time, place, and manner restrictions. Number two, if you violate time, place, and manner restrictions, you are subject to further penalties for violating those time, place, and manner. And that could include expulsion. That include losing your visa if you're a foreign student. It include jail time if you're obstructing a public thoroughfare, for instance. Whatever that is, that was accepted in the 60s as part of the deal if you wanted to do something beyond civil discourse. Additionally, for MIT, obviously providing places consistent with the rules, such as those you've described, third space or some, however inadequate, whatever you're going to do, as many of those as people feel, that's the university's function, so I do that. And the fourth is expecting some humility on the part of the institution as to how much the institution, MIT, can solve your personal upset, however justified it might be. Fixing Gaza is above Sally Kornbluth's pay grade, and I think that we should, I've been there. I was on the streets in various ways in the 60s, so I remember things like this. But it's also, and in the emotion, it's hard to remember some of these things. But it's like if you're expecting MIT, the institution, to solve a problem that you perceive, there are limits to what MIT can do. And I think it is helpful to recognize those. So I would offer that bundle of attitudes as my sense of where we need to be to deal with these things going forward, because there's some things that are not soluble by something that Sally Kornbluth might do. And I'd just be curious to see if amongst our discussants, whether maybe this bundle of views is something you'd both find agreeable, or there are things to disagree. So thanks.
So yes, everything you said resonates. I think a lot of students see themselves in the image of the Vietnam protests. And the thing that I find so silly about that is, like you said, however justified they might be in their opinions, back then there were American soldiers that were dying. It was our own family in many cases. Today, it's the connection between MIT and what's happening overseas is a lot more tenuous. They try and dress it up and say like, oh, well, MIT is taking money from the Israeli Ministry of Defense, and they lie about how much and about where it comes from and for what it's going to. But they say that, there's this connection, and therefore we need to disrupt everyone's lives. You can't have business as usual. They said no effing dialogue across difference, which is the name of the program that MIT set up to try and create some of these spaces. I think one man's emergency is another man's Tuesday, and so we can't let the opinions of a few disrupt everyone, no matter how justified that might be. So I think I agree with the vast majority of what you said.
Sure. I mean, I'll say on the issue of accepting consequences, like in the civil rights movement, people who chose to sit at the front of the bus knew that they were going to be arrested. I think that MIT students, if you're willing to protest and you're willing to violate the rules to do so, I think that they should accept those consequences. I think that ultimately, regardless of, what my own personal stance on the topics are, I personally never attended any of these rallies or any of these demonstrations. I'm somewhat sympathetic to their views, although I do have some particular grievances that I have with the organizations and stuff that were organizing these that I personally disagree with. But I think that ultimately, if these students are unwilling to face the consequences, knowing that they are violating the time, place, and manner restrictions that MIT places on them, that's, just cowardice, and that means that you don't actually believe in what you say you believe in. So I completely agree with that, for sure. On the issue of like the university being able to solve Gaza, I think obviously that is something that like Sally Kornbluth cannot just like with the motion of a pen is not going to do away with all of the suffering that's happening in Gaza. I think that MIT does play an important role though, and I think that as you mentioned, there were inflated figures that were put out which were just false for how much money the Israeli Ministry of Defense is sending to MIT. But I think that there is a connection there. There is some extent of a connection that some military, some technology being developed.
He also takes money from Qatar, which is where Hamas has its headquarters.
Sure. Yeah. No, for sure. I think that.
Both or neither, I would say.
No, I completely agree. For sure. I think that a lot of students, see these connections and they think that they're wrong. And I would say that if you're going to call out one but not the other, I would disagree with you on that point. But I do think that MIT students should probably protest, MIT's specific policy. I think that is largely what the protests that we've seen have been about MIT's specific policy, about accepting money from, what sources and that kind of stuff. Whether or not those issues are easily solvable, I think is a huge question. But I think that, obviously, we're not protesting, or, MIT students are not protesting to solve the entire issue of Israel and Palestine. But I think what they are trying to get at is the specific MIT policies.
I would just dispute one small thing, which is MIT is not neutral in an important way. We are an American university. We serve this country. We served this country in World War II. It's one of the reasons that we won is because we had the MIT scientists and engineers working for the Allies. And so in an important way, MIT is not neutral. We're not some global university that exists in a bubble where it's utopia. We serve the United States. And so if we're taking money from the Department of Defense to advance military projects, and you're upset with the direction that the United States is going, then you can vote in US elections. But that doesn't mean that we should be accusing professors of building killer drones, which he says he's not building, all because you disagree with the US being an ally of Israel.
About graduate student sentiment.
Yep.
The Graduate Student Union is an agency shop.
I sued them.
In the state of Massachusetts, you know where I'm going with this, but let me
Yeah.
ask the question. I don't know if everybody else is aware. In the state of Massachusetts, which is not a right-to-work state, everybody that's a graduate student has to pay dues to the union, whether they agree with their policies and practices or not. The leadership of the Graduate Student Union has proven itself to be quite radical in support of the Palestinians, in keeping with the Marxist-Leninist parent organization that they're part of. If you do the research, you'll find out that the union that they're part of is trying to organize all across campuses with a Marxist-Leninist perspective.
Yep.
So what's the general sense of other graduate students who just want to get their jobs done, get their degrees, get a decent pay with decent hours about the leadership of the GSU?
Right. So this has been the story of the entire last year. I'm so glad you asked about the union. I don't want to pay them a dime personally, and so we ended up winning this legal case against them that if you have a religious objection, as I do, or if you have a political objection, you no longer have to pay at least the non-representational portion of the dues to this union, which I consider to be anti-Semitic in many ways. In terms of the participation, they had their very first resolution ever about a ceasefire in Gaza, as opposed to anything that materially impacts students on MIT campus. The participation rate was, I think, less than 30% of the eligible population, which did not include people like me who were not eligible because we were not paying dues. Within that 30%, only 20% of the overall eligible population voted in favor of that resolution. So they claim that that was some sort of representative sample of the sentiment on campus, but clearly they didn't study statistics, because if you were to actually go out and ask the remaining 70% what they think, I'm very confident that they would not break the same way that the 30% who went to the trouble of voting on this ceasefire resolution actually think.
Yeah, hi, Alan Tate. So I know you don't have a crystal ball, but I'm curious your answer from a student perspective. How do you think the protests will evolve on MIT this fall? So will they get worse? Will they get better? And how do you think the administration's response will change?
As you mentioned, I do not have a crystal ball, unfortunately. I really wish I did for situations like this, but I think that for now we're going through sort of a lull in the terms of protests and demonstrations and stuff. They are still happening, obviously, but they haven't reached the heights that they did last semester for sure. I think that they are going to ramp up, though. Given that this is an election year, I think it's only natural that all of the sort of issues that come with an election, as well as the sort of issues that come with Israel and Palestine and the ongoing conflict there, I think that things are going to get very emotional. And I think also, as I mentioned previously, depending on who wins this election, things could get incredibly emotional at some point for many, many students on campus.
I think the administration was spooked by the Title VI case, which is the federal discrimination charge against the university, which if they were to lose, they could potentially lose federal funding. And the reason that the case, my understanding is that the most recent motion to dismiss succeeded, and MIT got the case dismissed. And the basis for that was that the judge found that there were increasing sanctions against some of the things that were breaking the rules. And so if MIT wants to stay out of court, it will probably, it would be smart to learn the lesson from that case and continue to ramp up punishment for the students who break the rules. And so I'm hopeful that eventually we'll cross a point where the most extreme students who are instigating all of this will be suspended, expelled, whatever the case may be. And then the rest of us can actually have a conversation. I think there's a lot of fatigue with the protests that have been happening, and students are just sick of it and want to move on. But it's this small insular group that will get more and more extreme, especially, like you said, as we approach the election.
Good job, Jeremy. I can't tell you how much I would love to be in your shoes. Let's put our engineers' hats. We talk, and so do you think that if you're lucky enough to have the president of the university that sticks to the two following principles? One, First Amendment as applied on campus, without restrictions. Some universities do that. And time and place and manner restrictions on the First Amendment, but not the ones that you were referring to, because you seem to have been referring to time and place and manner restrictions as promulgated by the by MIT, which could be different. It's the ones that Harvey is carrying in his head, which is court cases basically. Do you think that faithfully executing such approach would remove many problems, in particular the ones that Will was talking about, now or in the future when similar confrontations occur? And the second question, an additional one, do you think that MIT and other universities should reintroduce kind of watered down version of in loco parentis, where they choose sides, whatever side they need to choose. Obviously, it works both ways, so may choose the wrong side. But it's a watered down version of in loco parentis, and whether you would like it. And I'll finish with kind of like not advice, but kind of understanding. Thinking that everything will pass with age. Trust me. Talking a lot, trust me, doesn't. I'm the best example. But in most cases, talking too much and listening with their mouths passes away. So I would like to hear from all three of you on the proposal, which is, I'll summarize. First Amendment, time, etc., in place.
So I don't think that they're separate proposals. I think they're consistent. The courts sort of established this term of art, time, place, and manner, in order to figure out how do you achieve free speech when there are many different parties competing for the same platform. And so the one thing I'll note is that it doesn't literally apply at MIT because it is a private campus. MIT could do what it wants. If it wanted to say you can never protest at any time on MIT campus, they're within their rights to do that. But if we believe in the principle of free speech, then I do think that time, place, and manner is at least what has been the standard in order to encourage open dialogue. And the problem that we've been seeing is that MIT has something like time, place, and manner in place, but it just hasn't really been enforcing it. It let the encampment go on far too long, to the point where organizations like Hillel did not get to have their event in the space that we properly reserved. So just enforcing, like you have to reserve, you have to give notice of a protest, you can't use a bullhorn indoors, whatever it might be. I think just enforcing the existing rules could go a long way toward fixing the problem.
Sure. I mean, I think I ultimately, very strongly agree with the principles of the First Amendment, and I also think that time, place, and manner restrictions are fundamentally necessary to some extent. I also think, though, an interesting sort of problem we have here is that MIT is, after all, a private institution. So just as you mentioned, they would have the right to say, no more protesting allowed on our property whatsoever. That's well within their rights. I mean, ultimately, whether we think they should or should not do this, it is well within their rights to say, well, we're just not going to enforce the rules in this instance. I think that may be a bad choice and may set a bad precedent, but ultimately that is their prerogative at some point. I think that ultimately the sort of two things that you outlined, I don't know if this would alleviate all of the problems as it relates to sort of free speech and a lot of the issues that we've seen on campus, but I think that it would go a long way to working towards a solution where we can all sort of coexist together.
I would just correct one thing. I think if they selectively enforce the rules, I think that is definitional discrimination, and that opens them up to lawsuits such as this Title VI case.
Sure. No. I completely agree that, they should not, choose to enforce the rules only if it's people that they agree with or something. And I also, you mentioned sort of this idea of, universities taking sides or whatever. I also think that, at least on my view, would be pretty bad if universities were to start choosing, well, no, we're going to allow these people to protest, but not these other people to protest. I completely agree that, if we choose to allow people to protest, even if it does maybe violate partially the time, place, and manner restrictions, then apply that to both sides for sure.
Just want to add on to that a little bit. I think I'm just going to take a different angle on this topic. I think top-down rules can influence a lot of things in terms of free speech and how people interact. But I think this is more an issue of bottom-up culture. Actually, I think we got to be able to act from the bottom up, at the human level, at the individual level, and how we create a culture of people who can engage in civil discourse. And I think that's what a lot of people at MIT are trying to do, me included, and Isaac included. And I think as long as we succeed in that mission, I think imposing enforcing the First Amendment or time, place, and manner rules, I think that's going to be a lot easier. But I think this is a problem that cannot be solved alone by just imposing some rules, because it's definitely a human capital problem. And, I think we got to fix it from the bottom up. So, and this actually relates to the question that was asked previously about students today, not willing to accept the consequences for their actions. And you draw a parallel between what happened in the 60s, and people were actually arrested, and they were, they faced legal consequences for their actions. And I think Jonathan Haidt actually wrote a number of publications on this that illuminates this topic really well. And I think it's a generational problem. People today are, not to criticize my own generation, but I think there's something missing from the equation. I think there's definitely some sort of change from people back in the 1960s and people today. And people may say it's a problem with how people are raised with all these convenience factors. How we have social media, how we can access information at the tip of our fingers with our phones, and how we have all these technologies. So I think definitely. There's definitely a human capital issue that we could dig deeper into, and as long as once we fix that problem, that's when we can create a much better environment for free speech and open discourse. So I think this should be definitely, I think, the First Amendment rule and time, place, matter restrictions that you propose. I think that would, enforced equitably on both sides. I think that'd be great, but also we got to do it, from bottom up. So I think that's my thought.
So I think we're close to our end of time. Let's thank these talented students for their comments and reflections today.